Today, Côte d'Ivoire is one of the most prosperous countries in West Africa. It's generally had over 8% economic growth in recent years and pretty fair elections during that time too. This hasn't always been the case though. Starting in 2002, the country would experience nearly a decade of on and off civil war, divided between the mostly Muslim North and mostly Christian South. While the conflict did draw itself up along ethnic lines, this was not just the latest chapter of some vague, seemingly never-ending ethnic violence though. No, there are specific political and economic reasons why a country that had been unified for generations, despite its ethnic and religious differences, fell apart in civil war. Those reasons, of course, have their origins long before the war itself. Part 1. Côte d'Ivoire gained its independence from France in 1960 and spent its first 34 years of nationhood as a one-party state under the PDCI. Its leader was moderate, pro-France dictator Félix Houphouët-Boigny. France has always been a bit clingy with its African colonies, and even after granting them independence, France usually maintains significant influence. Houphouët-Boigny exemplified this. He had worked in the French colonial government before becoming president, and while in power was unfailing in his support of French interests, interfering on France's behalf in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and several other countries. As well, like most of formerly French Africa, France controlled Côte d'Ivoire's monetary policy through the CFA franc. All of this made Côte d'Ivoire perhaps France's closest ally in West Africa. In terms of domestic policy, Houphouët-Boigny was prone to some lavish spending, moving the country's capital from Abidjan to his hometown of Yamoussoukro, where he poured public funds into projects like the Polytechnic and the airport, as well as using his own fortune to build the largest church in the world, the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace. Côte d'Ivoire had more than enough money to go around, though. For its first few decades of independence, Côte d'Ivoire experienced an economic miracle, quickly becoming one of the richest countries in Africa as its GDP soared from $0.6 billion in 1960 to $9.2 billion in 1980. As well, while Houphouët-Boigny stayed in power for over 30 years, he did so without completely repressing the opposition. For the most part, he addressed their concerns by incorporating them into the PDCI government. So while he certainly had his faults, under Houphouët-Boigny's rule, Côte d'Ivoire saw nearly 20 years of uninterrupted growth and political stability. Problems arise in where this growth was coming from. Côte d'Ivoire is and was the largest exporter of cocoa in the world, and cocoa farming played a huge part in the nation's economic growth. The government under Houphouët-Boigny had invested greatly in agriculture, but at the expense of neglecting other sectors. Due to this dependence on cocoa, when prices started falling in 1978, Côte d'Ivoire's economy began to falter. At first, KSTAB, the National Agricultural Marketing Board, was able to take the hit and shield farmers from most of the damage. The hope was that prices would soon rise again and the government would make up for what it lost. However, as the crisis continued, propping up the price of cocoa became extremely expensive. And soon, with the government billions of dollars in debt, the economy collapsed. With few options left, Côte d'Ivoire began looking for emergency loans from the IMF. These loans stipulated that the government make massive cuts to social spending. But the country had nowhere else to go. However much freedom and support Houphouët-Boigny had given to international companies in the years prior, he still had no bargaining power when he asked them to compromise on cocoa prices, and his reputation as a level-headed and outward-looking leader gave him no additional flexibility with the IMF. So, Côte d'Ivoire reluctantly accepted the loans. The austerity measures imposed by the IMF crippled public education and health, and jeopardized farmers who could no longer rely on KSTAB for price stability. Not only did these requirements make Ivorians suffer economically, but they also destroyed the country's system of political patronage. While in some ways corrupt, by carefully dividing government positions between different groups, this system had kept the country stable for 20+ years. By restricting the government's spending decisions, the IMF had made politics an increasingly cutthroat game. Seeing their wages slip, many in Côte d'Ivoire began to question the Houphouëtist regime during this time. Thousands of disillusioned Ivorians took to the streets in protest, demanding democracy and an end to the neocolonialism of the French and the IMF. It was then in 1993, in the middle of all of this chaos, that Houphouët-Boigny died. He had chosen the president of the National Assembly, Henri Konan Bédié, to succeed him as president. The near simultaneous end of the country's economic prosperity, and of the life of its first and only president, opened Côte d'Ivoire up to exploitation by opportunistic politicians, whose policies of violence and exclusion would bring the country to the brink of war. Part 2. Rewinding back a few years, aside from benefiting native Ivorians, the economic boom of the 60s and 70s also encouraged immigration. Many of the cocoa plantation workers were migrants, either having moved south from the northern regions of Côte d'Ivoire or from neighboring countries like Burkina Faso. Despite ethnic and religious differences, these new arrivals were generally met with tolerance. Houphouët-Boigny welcomed them, with liberal land ownership laws making it easier for migrants to get a foothold economically, and ethnic quotas in government ensuring a level of political equality. During the 1980s, though, as jobs grew scarce and living standards fell, previously unimportant divisions like religion or ethnicity became inflamed. In these rising tensions, the new President Bédié saw an opportunity. Bédié had spent most of 1993 and 94 consolidating his power by cracking down on smaller opposition parties. His greatest threat for the upcoming 1995 election came from a man named Alassane Ouattara. Ouattara was the prime minister under Houphouët-Boigny, and upon his death he had contested the presidency with Bédié in a brief succession crisis. He primarily drew his support from the northern part of the country, particularly from immigrants. Ouattara himself had Burkinabe ancestry on his father's side, and while born in the south, he was a Muslim and part of the northern Dioula people. Aside from him, Bédié also faced opposition from those who had never been part of the PDCI establishment, namely Laurent Gbagbo. His leftist, nationalist rhetoric appealed to many young Southerners who were suffering from the economic collapse. So now Bédié is fighting on two fronts. On one hand, he has to defend the legitimacy of the PDCI against figures like Gbagbo, and on the other, he has to stop Ouattara from taking power within the party itself. Here is where Bédié saw his opportunity. By claiming that immigrants and people from the north had caused the economic crisis, and by labeling them as less Ivorian than those from the south, Bédié could shift blame away from the PDCI while also at the same time discrediting Ouattara on the basis of his ethnicity. This exclusionary redefinition of Ivorian nationality was known as Ivorité, and in addition to being a powerful message, it would also be the basis for numerous concrete policy changes. For example, Bédié would use Ivorité as justification to amend the electoral code less than a year before the election was set to take place. The code now required all presidential candidates to have 2 Ivorian parents, disqualifying Ouattara from running. Understandably, Ouattara split off from the PDCI to form his own party, the Rally of the Republicans, or RDR, and boycotted the election along with the other opposition candidates. Soon, discontent with Bédié spread to parts of the military, especially after he fired his general, Robert Gay, for refusing to suppress election protests. Eventually, this boiled over into an outright coup on December 23, 1999, with the military installing Gay as president and Bédié fleeing the country. Upon gaining power, Gay made a televised announcement in which he assured the public that he would uphold peace and democracy, and that he would continue to fulfill Côte d'Ivoire's international commitments. Many hoped that the coup would lead to reform, especially since its planners did outwardly reject Ivorité. But this would not be the case. Instead, just 7 months after promising free and fair elections, Gay reinstated Bédié's xenophobic two-parent rule, yet again disqualifying Ouattara. In some ways, this second implementation caused even more damage than the first, as while Bédié only amended the electoral code and did so about 11 months before the election, Gay did so just 3 months before and added it to the constitution itself. Gay then proceeded to lose the election to the one viable opposition candidate he had not in some way disqualified, Laurent Gbagbo. However, Gbagbo would only deepen Ivorité's wound on Côte d'Ivoire. He kept the existing candidacy rules and added new ones, for example creating new proof of identity requirements in 2001 that disenfranchised many Northerners, while also cranking up the xenophobic rhetoric. Once again, dissent began to grow in the military. Part 3. On September 19, 2002, 800 soldiers mutinied and attacked several major cities. While they failed to take the largest city of Abidjan, they quickly gained control over the north, establishing themselves in the cities of Bouaké and Korhogo. These soldiers, who called themselves the Patriotic Movement of Ivory Coast, or MPCI, were mostly Northerners and supporters of the RDR. Led by Guillaume Soro, they initially mutinied because the government had marked them for demobilization, which they saw as an act of anti-Northern prejudice. More broadly, they wanted an end to Ivorite and a redo of the 2000 election, and they were soon joined by thousands of others who wanted the same. Gbagbo's government responded swiftly. On the same day as the rebellion started, former General Robert Gay was shot, and Ouattara's house was burned down, along with the homes of many Burkinabe immigrants. Other countries soon involved themselves as well. On September 22nd, the French initiated Operation Licorne, starting with a force of 650. While France was quick to join the war, it was extremely hesitant to pick sides. France neither wanted to support Gbagbo's populist government nor risk undermining a historically close ally by supporting the rebels. Additionally, less than 10 years prior, the French had gotten themselves into a very sticky situation when their involvement may have helped Rwanda's government commit genocide in 1994. However, France couldn't just ignore the war either. 20,000 French citizens lived in Abidjan at the time, and French companies had a large stake in the Ivorian economy. France had also signed a treaty with Côte d'Ivoire upon its independence, stating that they would defend them if they ever faced a major military threat. As such, the French reluctantly entered the war, but promised to stay neutral. By October 17th, talks mediated by the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, had led to an initial ceasefire, with hopes for a more permanent agreement in the coming weeks. Yet even during this temporary peace, the conflict was in many ways still escalating. By the end of November, the MPCI was joined by two smaller rebel groups, the MPIGO and the MJP, both of which sprung up along the western border with Liberia in support of the late General Gay. In December, all three of these groups merged under Guillaume Soro to form the New Forces. On the pro-Gbagbo side, militias like the Young Patriots organized and began attacking RDR supporters in southern cities. France also expanded its role in the conflict, seeking to become a mediator of sorts between the two sides. They would enforce the October 17th ceasefire by creating a buffer zone sandwiched between the rebel and government-controlled territories. The French thought this would calm tensions enough to lead to a formal treaty. However, while the buffer zone did prevent the two sides from fighting each other, it also created a lot of additional resentment towards France. In order to establish the buffer zone, France essentially needed to take territory from both sides, and to maintain it through the frequent use of force. This is not to mention the awkwardness of a colonial power occupying a large chunk of its former colony. Thus, France's military peacekeeping efforts compromised their diplomatic ones, as both sides began to see France more as a belligerent than as a mediator. These tensions came to a head in January 2003 during the first true peace conference of the war. Occurring in the Marcoussis suburb of Paris and mediated by the chair of the French Constitutional Council, the Linus-Marcoussis Accords created a reconciliation government in which Gbagbo would stay in power but share it with a new temporary prime minister, Seydou Diarra, who had been the prime minister under Gay. All of the main rebel groups and political parties would receive representation in the new government, and the xenophobic citizenship and electoral policies would be phased out. Most controversially, the agreement would give the new forces control of the defense and interior ministries. Surprisingly, both Gbagbo and Soro signed the agreement. The reality was, though, that Gbagbo had no intention of actually following through with it. He was already suspicious of France's neutrality, so when a treaty with heavy French influence asked him to invite the rebels into the government and surrender control of the military to them, he entirely lost trust in both the agreement and the French. Framing the war as partially against France also proved a highly successful political move for Gbagbo. Recognizing that Gbagbo would likely reject another French organized treaty, ECOWAS decided to move talks to Ghana, where, after a few weeks of negotiation, Gbagbo signed another agreement. This time, the new forces allowed Gbagbo to maintain control over the defense and interior ministries. Just like with the Linus-Marcoussis Accords, though, despite having signed the treaty, Gbagbo refused to actually follow through with it. He did the same thing again for the next treaty. And the next. And the next. For 4 years. It looked like Gbagbo would not follow through with any treaty, no matter how favorable its conditions. This was frustrating, especially as violence began increasing again, with frequent fighting at the buffer zone. Conflict with the French surged as well, with French soldiers firing on Ivorian protesters and an accidental bombing of a French airbase by Gbagbo's forces, leading France to obliterate the Ivorian Air Force. After almost 6 years of division, though, many were growing tired of the war. Over 1,000 people had died, 750,000 had been displaced from their homes, and billions of dollars had been spent or destroyed. With great public pressure, including from the Ivorian football team, which used their entry into the World Cup as a platform to call for peace, Gbagbo and Soro met for the final time in Burkina Faso to discuss a treaty, creating the Ouagadougou Peace Agreement and finally bringing the conflict to an end. In Bouaké, Gbagbo and Soro met to symbolically burn the weapons of war, as the country began a long process of reintegration and forgiveness. Part 4. War again. Yeah, as with many conflicts, it often takes a second to tie up the loose ends of the first, and in the case of the Second Ivorian Civil War, that loose end was Gbagbo. Specifically, Gbagbo had refused to step down when he lost the November 2010 elections to Ouattara. Using his appointees in the Constitutional Council, he overrid the legitimate election results and claimed 51% of the vote. This came after almost 5 years of election delays due to the war. Needless to say, people were furious. Protests broke out across the country as both sides prepared for a return to the long-winded back and forth of the First Civil War. However, this conflict would be far more decisive. Within weeks, the new forces had retaken their northern territory. By the end of March, they had made it all the way to the coast, and on the night of March 31st, they marched straight into Abidjan. Besides dominating militarily, the rebels now also held a superior political position. France and the RDR had disapproved of Gbagbo from the beginning, but they were hesitant to support the rebels outright since that would have meant undermining the Ivorian state itself, which both of them relied on. After the elections, Gbagbo didn't have any legitimate authority in the Ivorian state, meaning that the French and RDR could explicitly align themselves with the rebels without going against the status quo. Reflecting their closer ties with the RDR, the new forces changed their name to the Republican Forces of Côte d'Ivoire, or RFCI. They also began receiving active military support from France. On April 11th, French forces led RFCI soldiers directly to Gbagbo's door, where he was arrested, ending the war after just 4.5 months. Despite being much shorter than the First Ivorian Civil War, the Second Ivorian Civil War was far bloodier, with fierce urban fighting and numerous massacres of civilians leading to over 3,000 deaths. With Gbagbo's capture and the subsequent end of Ivoirité, though, it looked like Côte d'Ivoire had finally found peace. Part 5. When most media outlets covered the Ivorian Civil Wars, they almost always made a point to note the ethnic and religious differences between the two sides. Many modern African conflicts have been analyzed through the familiar lens of ethnic violence, whether in Ethiopia or South Sudan. Sometimes these depictions are used in good faith, such as to point out the arbitrariness of colonial borders. In Côte d'Ivoire's case, it is unlikely that the North and South would have been part of the same country had Europeans not been involved. But doesn't this narrative that cultural differences cause wars in Africa seem a little bit incomplete? How exactly do these often minor differences lead to such intense hatred, especially between people that have often lived together for centuries? Why are similar conflicts outside of Africa not described in the same terms? And why is this narrative so common if it's such a poor explanation? I think the answer to that last question is that this narrative of ethnic violence often carries with it some unsaid claims. Namely that African people are too prejudiced and violent to exist in ethnically diverse states, and that multiculturalism in general is doomed to failure. The truth is, cultural differences do not cause wars on their own, in Africa or anywhere. Economic and political inequalities, combined with the selfish actions of leadership, are what cause wars like this. While the rebels were mostly Muslim, they were not fighting in the name of Islam, nor were Gbagbo's forces fighting in the name of Christianity. Instead, both fought for political reasons, with government supporters trying to defend their country from perceived foreign influence, while the rebels wished to end the oppression of northern Ivorians. Since the end of the civil wars, Côte d'Ivoire has had fairly tolerant leadership and a growing economy. Gbagbo, being acquitted of crimes against humanity by the ICC, has also been allowed to return. With greater political representation and fairness, Côte d'Ivoire is unified in spite of the ethnic tensions that supposedly doomed it to violence.